Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Commercial Solar Peaker Batteries Part 1. My name is Andrew, and I will be moderating. We will be beginning here very shortly, but before we do, there are a few things we must go over. Remember, everyone, it is very important to please be logged into the webinar through your own connection. This is required so that in the event that Halfmoon Education or you are audited by a licensing board, that we're able to accurately prove your attendance. Also, it's the only way for you to gain access to the brief quiz at the end of the program, which is a requirement if you're trying to obtain continuing ed credits. Next, I wanted to mention to the right of your screen, you'll see a panel. And towards the bottom of this panel, you'll see a dark gray questions bar. If you double click this, it will open and it will allow you to submit any questions you may have during the webinar. We encourage you to submit questions. Please feel free to ask any questions at any time, and either myself or the speaker will answer them as soon as we can. Lastly, if you should happen to lose sound for some reason during the webinar, please see the audio tab that's in the panel, and you'll have the option to dial in with your phone. For anything else that might come up, you can call Halfmoon's customer service at 715-835-5900. With that being said, I'd like to welcome and hand the microphone over to our great series speaker, J.R. Cromer.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Hey, Andrew, real quick, we didn't get this in testing. I have two monitors going up. So do you see the presentation or do you see my blank black desktop screen?
Nope, we see the presentation.
All right, sounds good. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Commercial Solar Peaker class. My name's John Cromer. I'm a mechanical engineer by degree. I've held a Master of Electrician Certificate of Responsibility in Mississippi. Also, same thing with Residential Builder. So I've passed both of those exams. I am a certified NABCEP PV installer, which is, it's kind of like what the American Institute of Architects is for architects. NABCEP PV installers are a private organization, but there's a test involved in a training path. Before I got into solar, I was an oil and gas engineer for Fluor Corporation. And in the mid-2000s, Fluor was building the very first solar dedicated silicon refineries. And I was researching solar and got access to some of their studies. And in one marketing report, a sales rep kind of said tongue-in-cheek, we may not know if scaling up the solar industry is a good idea because solar is so easily implemented that being energy design and construction engineers, we may find ourselves working ourselves out of a job. The one takeaway from that comment was, Fluor, a company who designs energy mega projects, may get its market cannibalized by smaller energy projects, by maybe more nimble companies. And so in other classes, we talk about solar fundamentals and code and residential off-grid. I've also gotten into digital load controls as well. But today, what I want to talk about is a very specific application of solar technology called a solar peaker or a battery peaker. Basically, what we're talking about today is commercial rooftop solar battery implementation. And the reason why this topic is important is out of utility scale, residential, and commercial solar project applications, this is the most cost-effective application of solar. And not many people know about it because it's new. And so by shining the light on some design principles, hopefully we can kind of grow this market. It's interesting when you go to an airport, and you take off. Now, usually the airport is in kind of a warehouse district, and you look at all those warehouses and you think, oh man, compared to a residential rooftop, there's so much empty space. Like these are really good, solar project sites compared to, kind of a small residential roof. But, look over here. Here's a solar array. You're more likely to see a solar array on top of a residential home than you are on a commercial business, which is weird because, businesses are open during the day, and the home is, or at least traditionally is considered to be empty during the day. Commercial businesses should be consuming the electricity from the solar array as it's being used, whereas with residential you have to get into net metering issues. How much, with this solar array, when it outflows into the grid, and 2/3 of a solar array's production is outflow on a residential system or more. How much is that outflow worth? You get into this grid policy issue with residential rooftop solar. But commercial, you have a large electrical load. And so you put a solar array on top of a commercial roof, and at least for a array that only covers the very best surface and not the whole surface, you don't have to deal with that buyback issue at all. So no worry about net metering policy, big economies of scale, available real estate that's free, and the fact that it's behind the meter means that you should be generating at a closer to retail value. Whereas if it were a utility scale application, you would have to have a big giant solar array outside the city and be generating at wholesale and selling it to the retail electric provider. So you're generating at a wholesale rate rather than a retail rate with utility scale. And so here we have a great opportunity for retail large project savings. So why isn't it happening? These numbers I think have remained mostly true. This is residential solar in dark blue, and we got commercial solar. That's non-residential rooftop solar is commercial solar, and this kind of light blue, and then the utility scale in gray. And this slide is interesting. It shows the impact of subsidies on the market because right now technically solar is in a state of decline because we're about right here in this chart. And the reason why solar is in this state of decline is because the solar tax credit was supposed to expire at the end of 2016. It later got extended, but what that did is it shoved a lot of projects into 2016, and so subsidies kind of messed with the market, so to speak. The long-term trend is still up. That's one thing this picture says. It's not really the topic of the presentation. What I think is another very interesting thing is the tax credit just got created in like 2009. That's when the tax credit got created. So kind of in the pre-tax credit era, look at that. Which is the biggest kid on the block? What is the biggest market segment in solar before the federal tax credit? And the answer is commercial solar. And so we have evidence of like the subsidies messing with the market here, but another way the tax credit really drove the solar market, for better or worse, is that it led to enough profitability for utility scale solar because of that tax credit. And the tax credit becomes kind of like a blank check. You do a $4 billion solar project, you got a 30% tax credit on $4 billion. That's going to develop larger projects rather than smaller ones. But now the tax credits are sunsetting, and so the impacts of these subsidies may not be as apparent. And so that suggests that maybe the commercial solar market segment is in for a boom. So why did residential be smaller than commercial, and then it kind of overtook it? Why did that happen? Well, at the residential level, we had a emergence of net metering. So in many states, in most states, you have a near retail generation rate for all of your solar electricity. That's called your net metering policy. And in some states, they don't have any net metering policy. And in those states, a lot of them are in the southeast United States. They don't have a very good solar economy because of that. But this is another example of where kind of a subsidy, this buyback rate. And again, I think net metering is probably the best electric policy we can have as a society. If there is such a thing as a good subsidy, net metering is a good subsidy, but it is a subsidy nonetheless. And so we see, the residential outflow issue of all this solar electricity being pushed back onto the grid being assisted by the emergence of net metering policies. Let's see, we've got a question. So the question is, the tax incentives for utility solar, are they phasing out like the residential credits? Actually, our tax code tends to treat corporations better than people. So while the residential tax credit is on the same phase out schedule as the commercial, so right now it's 26%, and it's going to be another year before that steps down to, I think, 22%, and then it'll step down in 2 years after, like 2023, it'll step down to 10%. And at the 2023 mark, the commercial tax credit remains at 10%, whereas the residential one drops out entirely. At least that's how it's supposed to play out. The commercial tax credit is not just the solar tax credit, it's a tax credit for domestic energy incentives. That has different rules for different technologies. So residential had net metering. Utility scale had this big blank tax credit check. Commercial dragged behind. Commercial arrays do not benefit from net metering policy as much as residential. And utility scale benefits from economies of scale more than commercial. But commercial project costs are still, you do a 200 or 300 kilowatt solar project, you're still closer to utility scale costs than you are to residential costs. Residential has a lot of soft cost in it. And that is in part because, solar installers want to make, a nice, healthy margin on a solar project. So, there's a minimum amount of money a solar installer is going to charge to put a project together and get up on a rooftop and do it. And the larger the project gets, the smaller that, profitability and margin grows. So by the time you get into utility scale, your supply chain and overhead fees are only a minority part of the project, whereas at the residential level, soft cost is the majority. So what I want to point out is commercial projects benefit from the economies of scale. There's less soft cost on a commercial project. It's more in line with utility scale projects than it is residential. That does not mean you can't err on the side of being too cheap on commercial projects. At the same time, they are under $2 a watt. So why is the commercial market so small? And we already talked about this slide, so I'm not going to spend too much more time on it. But the point is, you have a solar array, out in the field, and that'll generate at wholesale rates, whereas rooftop solar has the ability to generate at near retail. So, even in a 100% solar grid, imagine a world where we didn't have to worry about whether or not energy was green or clean because it was just all solar. let's say we generate 300% more solar than we actually need, so we can lift big rocks in the air and use that for storage. So much solar, it doesn't matter. We have tons of solar. There's still going to be a battle between big solar and small solar on what the consumer owned solar array is worth. At the same time, there's a valid argument to say that rooftop distributed energy could be more valuable than solar out in the field. But we need the technology to be able to adjust for it. Usually the grid operators are slower to make adjustments to the grid than consumers would want them to be. So we talked about this residential offset issue. In our off-grid class, we say, look, even sometimes, and this gets into some just prior assumed knowledge for batteries, but we'll get you the conclusion right now. Like sometimes utilities will have a discrepancy between the buyback rate for solar and what they charge you. So in my area, the charge is about 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and the buyback rate is about 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And so I could say, I'm going to store all that energy in a battery, and I'm going to store it at 12 cents instead of selling it back at 3 cents, and I'm going to save 9 cents off that process. But the problem is, well, what's the cost to run a battery? That battery has a fixed cost. You take the warranted life out of the battery, you take its output, and you divide it by that fixed cost, and you're going to get a cost per kilowatt hour of total output. And for these kind of advanced lithium ion batteries, your cost just to run the battery itself and not anything else, the all-in total project cost divided by the total kilowatt hours out of that, you're looking at 20 cents to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. And so, if the system costs 20 cents a kilowatt hour to use and you're only saving 9 cents off of it, you're losing money by storing that energy in a battery. And even though selling back to the grid at 3 cents is a horrible buyback rate, that in many cases will be the most economic option unless the arbitrage rate between what you could sell back at and what it's worth on site is greater than the cost to run the battery. And so a lot of residential customers look at batteries as like, oh, I'm going to use it to fix my grid policy. And what happens is they end up buying what I call a spiteful battery because it costs them money to do it, but they would rather have a lower electric bill and keep that electricity from the utility because A, they want the battery, B, they want to use the battery, and C, they're upset with the utility for giving them a bum deal, and so they're going to retaliate because of that, for better or worse. But it's not a very fun way to buy a battery. And long story short, the utilities are being aggressive about having punitive policies for rooftop solar. The TVA is using distributed energy resources as a justification to discriminate against consumer-owned resources and levy additional costs on top of them. And there's changes in residential rate structures, an increase in fixed fees, a decrease in the energy rate that water down net metering. Net metering isn't a long-term policy anyway. And then here's a commercial electric bill. Let's kind of get back into the commercial realm. How much is net metering worth to a customer? Anyway, here's a commercial electric bill, and what we can see here is they used let's see. Their bill is $3,858. Their kilowatt hour fee of this, almost $4,000. Yeah, here's a kilowatt hour fee, and look, they're buying their electricity for a penny a kilowatt hour. Their energy, and then there's percentage based taxes and fees, but and here's another little small transmission per kilowatt hour fee. But you go and you line item out all the energy kilowatt hour rates, and out of this $4,000 electric bill, less than, and this is an extreme case, and that's why I wanted to use it as the starting example. But here's a commercial customer that says, "Man, my electric bill is really high. You know, I need to be more energy efficient," but they're only paying a penny a kilowatt hour for their electricity. And so actually they need to be less energy efficient because they have the cheapest energy in the United States, and they're swimming in cheap energy. Their energy is a penny a kilowatt hour. The majority of this commercial bill is in kilowatt as opposed to kilowatt hour, kilowatt demand charges. And this is one of the highest demand charges in the country, at $27 a kilowatt. And so a commercial electric bill is not just based on energy, which is power measured in kilowatts times hours, time of day. So we have a graph, it says power, kilowatt hours. And what this is called is your load profile of your building. And so here's a large commercial load profile. And here in dark blue is where the load used to be, and in lighter blue is where the load is now that there's a solar array on the rooftop. So in this case, it's a 300 kilowatt hour solar array. A maximum building demand of 450 kilowatts. So this is a large building. It might be a elementary school. And then you put this, so the building has a 450 kilowatt demand charge. You put a 300 kilowatt array on top of it. And, what happens is the demand charge does not go down to, 150 kilowatts. The demand charge kind of, it goes from 450 down to 300. So the demand reduction is 150 kilowatts, but the solar array is 300 kilowatts. I'm like, all right, well, on the one hand, the solar array doesn't outflow onto the grid. The new load profile, doesn't ever go negative. So, your buyback policy, you don't have to worry about so much. But you're not getting a watt for watt demand reduction with solar. Solar, you're even in the case where the solar array meets up with the building's peak demand. What the solar array will do in that case is, instead of your peak occurring in the middle of the day, now it'll just occur in the morning, or in the evening. It'll create two spikier peaks rather than one large, taller, and flatter peak. And sometimes that can be useful, but solar by itself is not going to result in substantial demand charge savings. And furthermore, the main problem is that one cloud could come and tank the solar production for 10 minutes, but the building demand doesn't change. And so if the solar array turns off, the building demand will now spike and then come back down again. And so there'll be no demand savings for the entire month. And so that's even worse. What that means is commercial solar may not result in any demand savings. And so if your demand charge, in this case, it's extreme. In this case, the demand charge is, 75, 80% of the electric bill. If solar is not going to impact the demand charge, then a solar array that offsets 100% of the building's total energy, it might not reduce the electric bill by more than 10% because the bill's coming from the demand charge. It's not coming from the energy charge. And so the higher this demand charge goes, the more cost effective the commercial solar peakers that we're discussing become. What's interesting about a commercial solar peaker is that you're trying to take just the spikiest peaks and then dump them into charging a battery. And so here, your off-peak load increases while you're charging the battery, and your peak load decreases while you're discharging the battery. And so you're taking this spiky peak and then dumping it into off-peak times. But actually, when you get to so here's the beginning of the month, on day one, and we have this battery here, and the state of charge of the battery is shown in red. We're going to feature this software throughout the program, but I can model this in a spreadsheet, but I use commercial software to do it because it's faster and more professional. But so on day one of the month, on day one of the billing cycle, the solar battery turns on, and it is programmed to level a particular load. And so it goes on and it levels that load. And then on the next day, the battery kicks on soon because the battery's trying to catch the load. It's trying to, prevent the load from going above a particular threshold. So once your load gets close to that threshold, the battery turns on. On the next day, the battery turns on and says, at a little bit lower level. And really, what we're, if the battery was not sized large enough for this, the day with the spikiest peak, the spikiest peaks can be a little bit random because it has to do with all of your appliances turning on at the same time. But if you didn't have enough, battery capacity on this day of the spikiest peak, then, your demand is going to grow exponentially. And so when we model a commercial solar peaker, I find it very useful to visualize this kind of data for right sizing the battery. So I can say, okay, well, here's the maximum day of the month, but my, battery at a full state of charge did not get all the way down to zero. And so what I need to make sure is that my, in this case, the battery is programmed only to charge with solar production. And so it's really hard to see here, but there's a little pale green, kind of looks like a grease stain at the bottom down here. And so the solar array is charging the batteries. And the strategy for that is that the batteries qualify for the tax credit if they are charged with the solar array. So, it might be more cost effective to get rid of the solar array entirely and just do, a larger battery and then charge it, off peak so that you can fully recharge the battery and not just be dealing with half a battery. And so evaluating those options, how large, another difference could have been maybe they do a larger solar array. So the right size of a commercial solar peaker is primarily a battery bank. It's primarily a battery that charges off peak and discharges at peak times to reduce the demand charge. and then a little bit of solar for one of two reasons. The first reason is the tax credit. Adding a small solar array that is enough to charge the batteries will qualify the system for a 30% tax credit. And so as long as the solar array is only 20% of the total project cost, it's like getting a free solar array on top of it. So there are cases where just because of the tax credit, I know it's not the most noble of arguments to make, but in some cases, charging the battery with solar will improve the economics because of the tax incentive. In other cases, the solar array will actually be reducing, what might be the peak demand. So this particular case, all of their peak demand is occurring in the morning. This is high noon right here. So their peak demand is only occurring in the early morning. And during the day, during normal business operation, they don't really need to worry about their peak demand, although it does kind of peak in the middle of the day right here. What this is it's in Colorado, and this is a dentist office, and they're on all electric heat. And so this is the morning heat, clicking on. But in some businesses, their actual peak demand does occur in the middle of the day, like the previous example. And in that case, the solar array is reducing the building peak demand during peak times, and the battery is playing free safety. And so in a case where you can get demand reductions through solar with the battery playing free safety, the battery is only needing to shave off, a morning and an afternoon peak rather than the critical peak. There are cases where adding solar to the battery will make it more cost effective, independent of the tax credit. It's just a function of how each individual site uses its electricity. Now, when you add solar to a commercial battery, you also gain the ability to have on-site backup power, which is valuable in its own right. And so, in cases where solar does not substantially impact the project economics, I would still add solar to it so that you get even more value out of the system. So what we're going to be talking about is how to model and how to right size a commercial battery to do commercial demand management, and how that relates to sizing a solar array for that case. But the short of it is that spiky loads are the best. If you have a commercial facility that has a spiky electrical load and you're on a demand charge, you can generally get a good payback on a solar array just based off that demand rate structure. No more net metering, and yeah, the tax credit does help, but there are situations where it doesn't help. You can say, I don't need solar, I just need a battery. So here's just we're going to be doing economic calculations during class, but here is a small commercial rate structure where the energy rate is more like the residential rate and the demand rate is low. And here's a different rate structure where the energy rate is very low and the demand rate is very high. And why I want to point that out is commercial solar has been held back because the energy rates have been low and the demand rates have been high. And solar by itself has not been good enough to target that kind of rate structure. But batteries are changing the entire equation to where, having access to cheap electricity, but being able to manage a high demand charge can result in the most cost-effective equation. So batteries, the missing piece to unlocking demand savings with solar has been a lack of batteries. Solar produces its electricity during peak times, and often commercial businesses you need that electricity during peak times inherently. But solar by itself, even when installed on a facility that uses its peak energy during peak times, hasn't been good enough. All of a sudden, you take a solar array that would previously be generating at 3 cents a kilowatt hour, at well below retail price, and therefore it's not cost effective. You add a battery to it and you use it for peak demand management, the opposite occurs. Now you're generating electricity at above retail price. And so an expensive lithium ion battery that might cost 20 cents a kilowatt hour or 30 cents a kilowatt hour to run, all of a sudden that cost, which is a huge expense, but that cost doesn't matter because the cost savings are now above retail price. And if your payback is not good enough, what's interesting is instead of trying to shave off, the entire peak, instead of doing a system that is this large or this large to get your entire peak, you just do a system that's, that large, a small, demonstration project to gather data and demonstrate demand savings can actually have a better payback than a larger system that needs more storage. You get diminishing returns the further down, the spiky load you travel. So let's start evaluating some products. We're using the Tesla Powerwall 2 because it's a popular brand, and people ask and talk about it. And so we're gonna give it kind of a technical evaluation. Tesla recommends a $10,000 to $15,000 installation price for the Tesla Powerwall 2. So at the residential level, that becomes quite costly. The Tesla Powerwall 2 is only rated for 5 kilowatts of power output. And so if it were used as a backup residential battery, a residential air conditioner can use 10 kilowatts of power. I have a energy efficient 21 SEER ream heat pump, and if the auxiliary electric backup heater turns on to defrost the air conditioning unit, it uses 10 kilowatts of power. And so the Tesla Powerwall 2 is not good enough to back up an entire home. And even if you bought 2 of them, let's say you got 2 for 20,000 instead of 1 for 15. Even if you bought 2 of them, it still might not be enough power to back up the entire home. You might have to make some rough decisions between, which appliances you want to use. We actually do, automation to help out with that. It's a 13.5 kilowatt hour battery. And so, that means that the Tesla Powerwall 2 will run for 2.5 hours at a 5 kilowatt output. So it's a 13 kilowatt hour battery. You can't use all 13 kilowatt hours over the course of 1 hour. There's a throttle on it. So it says, with our system, we only do 5 kilowatts for 2.5 hours. They'll give you a total output warranty. And so it's about 40,000 kilowatt hours. And so if you take the installation price and you divide by the kilowatt hours, it comes out to be about 25 cents to 40 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's, and plus, the cost of the electricity to charge it. And so, your residential lithium ion solutions that are the best out there are costing, upwards of 25 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour for the output. So running off of these batteries is often an expensive proposition, which is why off-grid, works best when you're faced with grid expansion costs or other high costs. But otherwise, using the grid there is, usually the most economic decision. But for us, what we're looking at it for a commercial array, what we're learning about this Tesla Powerwall is one Powerwall that costs about, we're assuming commercial installation pricing, so it's going to be multiple units on the lower end of the spectrum. We can safely pencil in $10,000 for 5 kilowatts output, and it'll run for 2.5 hours. And so what that means is, my spiky load. This looks like it might be a 1.5 hour load. I'd have to go and examine the actual data. But what if this load right here is less than 2.5 hours, then the Tesla Powerwall can be guaranteed to take off 5 kilowatts of that demand. And so let's look at that. If you said our Tesla Powerwall, let's say that it's running for 4 hours a day at 5 days a month at 5 kilowatts. And why would it be running for 4 hours a day instead of 2.5? Well, it's not so precise that it is just going to surgically remove your peak demand. It needs to make sure that it's catching your demand, at the right level. And, so if you're taking 5 kilowatts off at that bottom design threshold, you might be hitting it on that peak day for more than just 2.5 hours. So let's say on that peak day, you need to have, 4 hours of preparedness. That could be running it in the morning, charging it with solar, and then in the middle of the day, and then running it in the evening. And then that peak day is not going to occur every single day of the month. That peak day by definition is the one peak day of maximum usage, not your average peak throughout every single day of the month. And so, this commercial peaker plant is not cycling those batteries every single day. In a residential case, you every single day you'd be charging the batteries with solar and then discharging them at night to reduce outflow onto the grid or something like that. But in a commercial solar peaker, if you're running it every single day, you might have oversized it. If it's truly generating peak energy, it's not going to need to be run every single day. So there's a smaller system might be a better solution. But anyway, this is our assumptions. If we have a $10 a kilowatt rate and a 9-cent energy rate, the battery by itself is not saving us anything off of that energy rate. And the payback is quite long. If the energy rate was 6 cents and you had a higher demand charge, the payback is half, at the lower demand charge. So what I'm saying is the demand charge here is the end all equation. Is the end all secret to whether or not you can add batteries to your facility in a cost effective manner. And this is doing it just like the slapdash, call up your Tesla Powerwall commercial division, say, I want to do a project tomorrow. And they're like, we don't have installers in your area. And you're like, I don't care. It's going to be a big project. Tell me who's closest to me and I'll give them a call. And you get it installed in, the next few months. If you do some project planning, you maybe move away from the Tesla architecture, you could see improved economics. How much solar do you need to charge a commercial battery? The commercial peaker is only there for peak energy. And so you're not sizing the array to do 100% of your facility. You're sizing the array to qualify the batteries for a tax credit that you only get if the batteries are charged with solar. In fact, you have to return the percentage of the tax credit that you claimed if you begin to charge your batteries with the grid. I think that's surprisingly flexible. If you charge the batteries with 80% solar or more is the cutoff. So if you grid charge the batteries with more than 20%, then you have to give the entire tax credit back. But the point is, a solar array, 1 watt on a commercial flat roof will produce about 1.2 kilowatt hours of electricity a year. We use the PV Watt software to determine that. So 1 kilowatt will produce about 100 kilowatt hours a month, and so the battery is only being used 4 hours a day for 5 days a month. That's 20. At 5 kilowatt hours, that's 100 kilowatt hours. And so, a 1 kilowatt array in this example, would be, we're assuming 50 kilowatt hours per month to charge the battery, and the excess value is negligible. I don't know if 4 hours a day, 5 days. I think I did that wrong. But what we're looking at is for a 5 kilowatt commercial solar battery, maybe 1 kilowatt of solar is all that's needed. So we're talking about small projects. If you're trying to level, 200 kilowatts of demand, which is, you're getting into large project sizes at that point. It might be a 600 kilowatt array to offset 100% of its electric bill, but it would only on a 200 kilowatt demand rate, you would only need a 40 kilowatt solar array, to reduce peak demand in the middle of the day and charge the batteries up to qualify for the tax credit. And you wouldn't want to do more than that because, again, under a demand rate structure, the energy component is not worth anything. And so producing surplus solar electricity is not worth anything. Okay, so what we're looking at is, the Tesla Powerwall, 20 hours of runtime, 100 kilowatt hours a month. 1 kilowatt produces about 50 kilowatt hours a month, reliably. And so to really say, okay, let's make sure we have enough solar to charge up these batteries. A 2 kilowatt array would be more than sufficient. And so for a 50 kilowatt, if we're doing a 50 kilowatt worth of batteries, 20 kilowatts will be kind of overkill for the application. So let's look at what that project would cost. Let's say you get a 20 kilowatt solar project at $2 a watt. Can you get $2 a watt commercial? You can. It's kind of a small project at $2 a watt. It's not impossible, but it's assisted along because there's other stuff to be done. We're talking about a total project budget of $140,000. The solar component is $40,000. So I say this is really a battery project, but we're going to use our solar installer to do it because that way we can get the solar array on the rooftop kind of folded into those project costs. Qualified for the solar tax credit of $42,000. And so, so what we're looking at, let me pull up my calculator because I didn't really follow all the math out there. So we're looking at $140,000. I guess now the tax credit isn't 30%, it's 26%. So, let's let's do it. I'm 74%. So you're looking at 103, 104,000 after the tax credit. The energy rate, if half of our solar array is going to charge the batteries and the other half is going into the grid, and we oversized the solar array intentionally to make sure that we had the energy we needed to charge the batteries, but at the same time, we're not excessively oversizing it. If we're at a 6 cent a kilowatt hour energy rate, the monthly savings, no, the annual savings of the 20 kilowatt solar array on the electric bill is $750. So on a $103,000 project, now that's not that much. But if we have 10 Tesla power walls installed at $10,000 each, at 5 kW each, and they're leveling 50 kilowatts of demand, and my demand charge is $20 a month, what we're looking at is $12,000 a year in demand savings. And so, what I want you to look at on this slide is the $750 of energy savings versus the $12,000 of demand savings, just to kind of hammer home the fact that, like, you're sizing these systems to be, with the energy component not really even being a consideration at all. The system is sized to specifically target peak demand because that is where, the greatest breakout is. And so you're looking at, after the tax credit, $100,000 project. Let's assume there's $750 of electric savings a year. Fine, but the system's going to need, some maintenance. And so, let's set aside that $750 for maintenance budget and say, okay, the system has a payback of about 8 years. Which, an 8-year payback on adding a battery that has, an expected life of about 10 years is not great, but it's not bad, especially when you understand that energy storage value might be a little bit different than other energy efficiency upgrades where you expect a payback and a profit. That those batteries are there not just to provide peak demand savings, but they serve an additional purpose of the facility to some extent, maybe backup servers, maybe power over Ethernet lighting, but to some extent giving the facility backup power capability while having a path towards that actually paying itself back is a pretty good value. And then again, if you're always facing a payback that is not good enough in your model, what you do is you downsize it. You say, okay, that was with 10 power walls, installed at $10,000 each. Why don't I try it with 5 power walls installed at $13,000 each and see if there's a substantial change to the payback year? Why don't I get rid of the solar array and see if there's a substantial change to the payback year? Okay, so grid reliability is that value. Whenever a hurricane scrapes across the coastline, it causes multiple power failures. It's nice to have backup power. It's nice to have gas backup power, but you run out of gas. It's nice to have storage power, gas, and solar. Be really prepared. What the solar peakers are doing is giving facility owners the way to add backup power to their facility with a way that they can actually make their money back off of their investment over the life of the system. And so, here's an example where solar and batteries can work really well together because, remember back on that $40,000 solar cost on the $140,000 battery system, the batteries for reducing demand, even though they're the necessary component because they provide the intelligence and the responsibility, whereas the solar array is freewheeling. The sun comes up, it produces energy, sun sets, it goes back down. But still, the solar array component can be a cheap component for demand reduction. So, for this particular facility, it has what I call a plateau in the middle of the day. It has a high load in the middle of the day. And so if you were sizing this load profile for a commercial solar peaker and you only had a small project or you wanted to do a demonstration project, the most cost effective project would be just kind of large enough to do these peaks or maybe even half that size, and just say, whenever your day of spikiest peak is going to come, it's going to turn on and give it a clip. Although I think I don't have tons of experience in this. If you go too small, that might not leave you well prepared enough. So, I think a nice solar peaker system is on your month of maximum demand. It's taking care of your spiky peaks throughout the day. So we size a battery system, to do this much energy and then maybe a little bit of reserve capacity. And so, a solar battery that only stores maybe, 1%, maybe a 0.5% of the building's total energy usage could still have an economic impact on the demand charge. But if you wanted to do more than just, a little demonstration project, if you wanted to do something that had real substantial savings onto this bill, all of a sudden you have to start running that battery, not just for 2.5 hours a day, but the further you go down that load, now you're having to run the battery for 6-7 hours a day. And so all of a sudden because you're facing this plateau, you've shaved off your spiky peaks and now you're at the plateau and you face diminishing returns with your solar peaker from that point forward. And so that's where solar comes in to say, you know what, I'm cheaper than batteries kilowatt for kilowatt. And so on this particular building where their load profile is consistently in the middle of the day, the solar array comes in, reduces that load profile, and then the battery is really just hanging out and shaving off little tiny peaks, although you would need, 15 minutes of reserve capacity, in case a cloud came. This type of load profile is associated with sunny days. Cloudy days have more reduced load profiles. The problem is partly cloudy days. So, even when you're doing something this large, you need some capacity, but not so much as what would be an 8-hour load throughout the entire day. And so what that means is in commercial solar, we've seen large rooftop systems that cover an entire roof, and maybe what held the project back was, half of my building's rooftop is pushed to the limit structurally. So we could only do a small project, or maybe you don't have a well-suited roof for solar and you can only fit a small project. All of a sudden, the solar array being there just to do some peak demand reduction and charge the batteries, that can fit onto more roof surfaces than one that is a much larger project commitment. And so, whereas the old model would be to take a fixed amount of budget and to say, how much roof can I cover with solar for that budget? For the same budget, it would be better to spend, 80% of the project cost on the battery itself and then 20% of the project cost on the solar array that charges it. Now, what I think is interesting is that net metering and the whole debate around net metering is a one-for-one energy exchange. If I want retail value for my solar production, so if I sell a kilowatt hour to the utility and then I buy a kilowatt hour back, I want it to be an even trade. And that's a one-for-one value. And utilities don't see it the same way as the guy on the other side of the meter. Utilities say, no, I want a 1-to-2 value for every kilowatt hour you send me, I'll give you half its value and sell you, full price otherwise because I got more to do in this transaction than you do. And so, like the debate about buyback rates and policy has always been about, does the customer get retail value for their electricity or do they get less than retail value? But what a solar peaker does is it turns that on edge. It kind of exploits this demand rate structure to say, I'm only going to be my solar array is only going to produce 10% of my facility's energy or 5% of my facility's energy, but it might be reducing your electric bill by 30% or more. So by nature, every kilowatt hour that the solar battery system processes is resulting in a above retail price savings. And so that is why, an expensive battery that might cost 25 to 40 cents a kilowatt hour to run, could actually be saving the facility $1 or $2 or more, $10 a kilowatt hour to run. And so, it kind of turns that on end to say, there's this behind the meter opportunity. And so I guess here's where we're stating like, okay, well, yes, every electric load profile has a peak. This is a load profile for a high school. And, you would have to use, in this circumstance, you would have to use a solar array to create peaks to load level in this situation. So, when vetting a job site for a commercial solar peaker, the spikiest peaks, the spikiest loads are the best ones. The plateaus are harder. And so just as some design principles, I'd say, have a small enough battery to remain cost effective. If your battery is having to run 8 hours a day on the day of peak demand, then you might want to go with something smaller. Have a large enough battery to shave off any morning or evening or midday spiky peak. And so like I would say, you're still in the realm of designing a solar peaker. Here you have a large load. If you add a large solar array to it to create these morning peaks and evening peaks, kind of the maximum peaker size I would look at is about half that and no more. Otherwise you start getting into base load, and batteries, are very expensive. They're not going to be economic yet for base load storage. Have a large enough solar array to reduce peak demand in the middle of the day. So if you can have your solar array doing playing the game of peak demand management during the day so that your battery doesn't have to worry about it and can just play free safety, that's a nice sweet spot to be in. Um, don't overkill the solar array size. Its primary reason to be there is going to be to qualify the system for the tax credit, and then look at your critical loads. What does my facility want to back up in a power outage that are not currently backed up, and because that would be the opportunity to tweak any system size to meet those loads. Okay, so by now we should kind of have had it in our head to know that high demand charges are good for solar peakers and low demand charges are bad. Um, what are demand charges like? Well, when I got into solar and started looking at demand charges, there was like very little data. You would have to go to each individual utility website and see if they had a demand charge or not and find out what the demand charge was. But there was a survey done in 2017, and they broke out demand charges, at like we'll just go to the picture. We can go back there. But these are demand charges over $30, and red is 20 to 30, and orange is kind of typical, which is 10 to 20, and then light orange is cheaper, and then yellow is actually no data, or yellow is none, and then white is no data. So let's just assume that in those areas there's not a lot of people. What's interesting about demand charges is you can be in the middle of the country and run into high demand charges. So here's a little pocket of here's a little pocket of Illinois, right around St. Louis, where the demand charges are incredibly high. Mississippi is another state where they have about average retail price electricity, and they have very high demand charges. So you get in New York City, you get New York City kilowatt hour charges, and you get New York City demand charges. In Mississippi, you get Mississippi energy charges, and you get New York City demand charges. It's the energy component is cheap, but the demand component is expensive. And so you might be sitting in a particular market that doesn't have a solar market that you know of, because they might not have net metering. But then discover that actually, we have sky high demand charges. So our average electricity cost is cheap, but the way it's broken out on the bill is such that the demand charges are top heavy. And so you don't have to be in an area of high priced electricity to do a commercial solar peaker. You just have to be in an area where there's high demand charges. Well, they're not always one and the same. And often they're not. That's how they implement, their billing structure on rural grids, to say we want manufacturers, so we're going to provide you with cheap kilowatt hour rates, but you have to pay for the load that your process puts onto the grid, and that's why we give you a high demand charge. Then they get in. There's more complicated rate structures that break things out into tiers. So maybe your first kW will cost this much, your next kW will cost that much, or they make them even more rectangular, where they say your energy price for this much demand is going to be this amount, and then your energy price for the next up demand is going to be that amount. In all cases, the higher the demand charge goes, and the greater the difference between peak and off-peak tiers or rate structures, the greater the savings opportunity between that. So whether it's spiky tiers or spiky demand rate structures or spiky time of use structures, those variable rate structures are what can be optimized. And so, which utilities have demand charges above $15 a kilowatt, which are good opportunities for implementing this technology? And remember, it's not just about implementing the technology. It's when you're implementing this technology, you are adding, distributed storage and distributed power to the grid, which, one, like it or not, that's where we're heading. And so the more storage we have on the grid, the easier it is for everyone to make that transition to clean energy and to more reliable electricity, and ultimately to cheaper electricity. So, uh, which utilities have these demand charges? So many do. 2,400 utilities have demand charges. 70% of commercial customers are on demand charges. The majority of commercial customers who are not on demand charges are small businesses that have electric loads similar to a house rather than a business. And so, Oklahoma is a great example of, they don't quite have true net metering and they have cheap electricity pricing, but, you might find a $15 kilowatt demand charge in Oklahoma and have a viable project nonetheless. That $26 kilowatt example we looked at, that was for a dental office in Colorado. You can see how Colorado has some pockets up in the mountains that have very high demand charges. Here's a kind of a different map that shows customers eligible for demand charges above $15. And so, this is kind of a predictor of where the demand charge market really is, being a function of both price and population density. And I think that's interesting. Like Lubbock, Texas. I wouldn't think of Lubbock, Texas as having high electricity pricing, but I could see how, they have such cheap energy up in Lubbock because there's so many wind farms, but wind farms produce volatility similar to solar. And so, that results in a market where there are high demand charges and still a lot of customers, presumably. And so, this can work even in cheap electricity markets, depending on the demand charge rates. And so this is like a map of states that have installed solar. 2018, so it might be a little dated, but nonetheless, there are states out here like like Southern Illinois or Iowa would be a great one. Not much solar work going on in Iowa, but they do have high demand charges, and so there's opportunity in this market. Okay. Um, it does require reading your electric bill. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm actually going to do the design example after our break because that will allow me to queue it up and we'll save a little bit of time doing that. But might as well go ahead and explain it because we still got a few minutes and we'll take our break right at half after, so in about 15 minutes. Um, I use commercial design software. There's a great software out there called Solar Design Tool that is uniquely focused on commercial battery modeling. So if there's a tool out there for the job, then why not use it? Other answer is because you just want to tinker around and think a little bit about it before putting too much time or money into it. So here's where a client, jeez, Mississippi, stormy weather. I don't know if y'all are getting that or not, but if I go black, it's because this heavens of earth are opening up above me. Um, anyway, the client emails me their interval data. So this is something that most utilities should be able to provide a customer on a demand rate structure. Is their 15-minute interval data. If they don't have it, they should if they have a digital meter on the side of their uh, of the building. So often you can get it as a often you can get it as a download in your utility account. But what is interesting to me is right off the bat, you can see if January is over on the left side here. This is me just plugging the interval data into a spreadsheet and then graphing it for each day of the year on a spreadsheet. And what surprised me was, often I associate heavy loads with being in the summertime, and actually there was a heavy load right here in the summertime for 15 minutes. So who knows what that was? Maybe it was a big day of deliveries or office party or some renovation work being done and all the doors are open or something. I don't know, but what we see is actually for this particular site, uh, January and February and March and November and December have much spikier loads than the summertime. So I kind of zoom in on the days and I can see, okay, well, the spiky load. So right now, this is not using commercial design software. This is just using spreadsheet analysis. And say, all right, well, the spiky loads are really just occurring, at the very beginning of the day, and that's it. And this is like a perfect opportunity for commercial solar peakers. So then we go and we look at one day of the electric load, and what we see is on this one day, the during the day when the office is open, they're only pulling a 20 kilowatt load. But when their electric heat in the morning, so their electric heat turns on at 8, and then it turns off at 9:30. It's a 1.5 hour cycle, of which it really starts to ramp up for 1 hour. So that's actually quite a huge load for electric heat. And this is where like knowledge of the rate structures get a little tricky because some utilities, you have to have a minimum load to get onto a demand rate structure, and they kind of see it as a penalty. But what this begs the question is, if you do a solar peaker battery that is 75 kilowatts and is enough to store this entire segment, you might kick the customer off of the demand rate structure, which would not usually be advantageous because you've just gone from a system that reduces the demand to a system that needs energy to be cost effective. So the point of it is you need to be familiar with your rate structures when you're designing these things. But for this system, it might be a 50 kilowatt system that only needs an hour of storage capacity is more than sufficient to reduce that demand charge by 50%, and that demand charge for this customer was 90% of their bill. And so being able to do a 10 Tesla Powerwall project for $100,000 on a $38,000 bill or $3,800 monthly bill, for these winter months, you might be, you would be reducing that bill by $1,700 a month. And even on those errant months in the the summertime, like this one right here, most of the time, most days, you wouldn't ever need the battery but you're still going to get that demand savings for those unfortunate days where you have a extreme energy event on site. And so, with maybe so for 10 months out of the year, your 50 kilowatt hour solar peak that is not doing the entire peak, but is only just shaving off, the tippiest tops of the peak. And then, in the summertime, it might get a little more aggressive because in the wintertime, you're staying above 51 kilowatts. Is more of a right size. So here's that kind of errant day where what happened is maybe a cold front blew in, or maybe the air condition or a heat wave, one of the two. Maybe the electric. This is Colorado, so who knows? Maybe an electric heater triggered when it shouldn't have, or maybe the air conditioners ran harder than they thought and iced up, and then turned on their electric heaters inside. But you can see how, even though this is not the day that we are hitting our max peak demand for the year, here we're not at 100 kilowatts, we're at 78 kilowatts, but a 50 kilowatt solar peaker would still be able to eliminate that portion of the bill. And in that case, that again would have, let's see, 100 kW of 50 kW of output capacity at $26 a kilowatt hour is going to give you, like $2,500 of savings, monthly savings for most months of the year. So anyway, here we're looking at electric rates, and this is just saying, okay, this is for small general service where you have a monthly meter fee and then an energy only charge, and that's like residential customers. So that's not good enough. So now we're sizing the system. And so what I'm looking at is we have their interval data that gives us their power for every single day of the year, every single 15-minute period. We also can get hourly solar production data from PV Watts. And so this, I'm just going to very quickly do an example. And I'm going quickly through it because this is pretty elementary. You take any solar class and they should be, they should be covering PV Watts. It's in fact, while I'm here, let me put it into the chat box. Oh, that was a question. Let me put it in the chat box. There you go. So you can do this in your area too. So I just put in, Kansas City, Kansas. I always do PV Watts for a 1 kilowatt array because that makes a scalar. And so in my spreadsheet, I could have a box for the array size. And if I have my 1 kilowatt production data, I can put in, a 20 kilowatt array, and it changes all my data for me. A commercial rooftop system is usually at a shallow tilt angle. At shallow tilt angles, the orientation of the array doesn't really matter. And so, I'm just making some slight adjustments to PV Watts. And then at the tail end of PV Watts, this is, okay, 1 watt is producing 1.4 kilowatt hours a year. Other classes, I say, know that ratio because you can perform solar energy estimates in your head. If you know what 1 watt will do per kilowatt hour, that's nice. What I want to show you in this more advanced class is you can download the hourly PV Watts results into a comma separated value file. And so here we are with our PV watts numbers. And what we see here, this is not building interval data. This is the PV watt solar performance data. And it's broken out, by hour. And the problem is this is broken out by hour, but the building interval data is usually broken out by 15 minutes or by 30 minutes. And so what I do is I take this PV watts data and I copy and paste it 4 times, and that gives me, because the system output at high noon on January 1st is 154 watts, and that's assuming it's going to be 150 watts at 12 and at 12:15 and at 12:30 and at 12:45, and that's as granular as data as PV watts is going to give us. And so the short of it is, I want to take my building interval data, how much, what's my consumption, and I want to take my solar performance data, what's my production, how much energy is available to charge up my battery, and then at that point, I start to look at, this is what I do in off-grid. I take all the energy that's being produced, all the energy that's being consumed, I subtract them from each other and see how negative my battery bank gets. And how negative my battery bank gets tells me the, largest size of battery that I need to size my off-grid system. And at some point I break down and say, okay, I need a backup gas generator to overcome, certain overcast days to reduce my system size. Well, this is a little bit different. In this model, what we need to do is look at the, let me get this back on full screen here, a couple minutes before our break. So what we're doing here in this design is we're looking at the old kilowatt max load of that dentist office. And so what we realized here is there are going to be certain months like June where there's not going to be a huge max load. And then there's going to be other months like in the wintertime that we saw where the max load was quite large. And also the utility wants to see a maximum annual load of at least 51 kilowatts, and that doesn't have to be every single month. And so, what I've done here is set up different targets for each month to say, okay, in January and February and November and December, and to some extent, March and April as well, we are in our period of maximum battery usage, maximum peak demand. That's when our solar peaker is going to be on most of all. And so for these months, I'm just going to try and get down to a 51 kilowatt demand reduction. And that way I can not worry about being booted off of my demand rate structure. But there might be on other months where you have so much storage capacity that you could actually use that same size battery to push your savings below 51 kilowatts. So there's only 1 month needs to be above the minimally qualifying demand threshold. So really all I'm trying to say is that on periods of your peak demand, you might be reducing your demand to a higher threshold, and then on months of off-peak demand, that threshold might be even lower. And so on most commercial solar peaker batteries, which are the same inverters as residential inverters. Sometimes you get them in larger form factors, sometimes not, but they have a they monitor your electric service panel and then turn the system on and off based on the electricity that's actually flowing through your meter. So what I'm trying to say is your high-end residential off-grid battery inverters have different modes of operation, and one of those modes of operation is demand management. And so, the what can be used as a high-end residential off-grid inverter, the exact same system can be put on top of a large commercial building as like a peak energy system. So what we're going to look at is a 90 kilowatt hour AC battery bank and inverter. So instead of getting the custom multiple small Tesla Powerwalls, we might be opting for a larger battery inverter and sourcing our batteries not through Tesla but through a competitive bid process. And we look at a small solar array added on top and the 30% tax credit. And remember, this particular customer had like the most extreme demand rate structure. They had $27 a kilowatt of demand rates. And the payback on his system is 4.5 years, which is phenomenal. It's very easy to sell a solar battery at a 4.5 year payback. So again, we're gonna look at our model in a little bit more detail, and then we're gonna start getting into different battery technologies and specification sheets. But for now, we are at our 15-minute break, and so let's take 15 minutes and see you in 15 minutes. we're going to pick back up in about 2 minutes. I'm just kind of showing off my home automation, energy automations that I do if you're here. But we're going to pick back up in about a minute or so. All right, so welcome back. I have a service panel monitor, a consumption monitor installed in my house, and so what I can see here is that my electric load goes up to 8 kilowatts when my air conditioner and water tank kind of come on at the same time. So here's my air conditioner, pretty regular loads, and most likely this is my water tank. And when they stack up at the same time, I get that peak load. And so again, electric loads are spiky. As zoom in on any electric load, and you're going to get spikes up at the top. The only thing that smooths all this out is increasing the scale. A large facility might have a plateau. Smaller facilities with high electric bills generally have very spiky loads. This is what I do over at level. Okay, before we review our example, why don't we learn a little bit more about different lithium-ion or battery technologies. This is a lithium iron phosphate battery. And lithium iron phosphate is considered to be a higher tier battery than standard lithium ion, which is also called lithium cobalt. And so there's actually like a bottom shelf and a top shelf to lithium ion batteries, and lithium cobalt batteries are considered bottom shelf, and lithium iron phosphate is considered better. And the thing about lithium iron phosphate is they last twice as long and they cost twice as much. And so, the thing about why would you buy one versus the other is, if there's applications where you do not want to swap out the battery down the road, lithium iron phosphate over the life cycle will come out ahead because it lasts longer, but not by much. And there is I think, an element of wisdom into, go with the lower end lithium ion today, because lithium ion prices are still expensive and still coming down in price. So, this is a choice we encounter in residential off-grid all the time. Do you pay a lot up front for a very long-lasting battery, or try and, split the middle between, not going too far down in your product selection, but maybe, storage is expensive. So that's often the pinch point in your project budget. But there are other applications, whether it be like a remote weather monitoring station where the batteries are up a tower, or even on a film set where you're using a battery powered device and you don't want to have to swap it out so often, where a higher end battery can make sense. So what's interesting about this spec sheet is we get a cycle rating, and what we can see is that the cycles are much shorter if we are fully charging and discharging the battery, as opposed to if we were only using 80% of its capacity and charging it back up again. Now, how many of us are hard on our cell phones by letting them fully drain and discharge, and then we plug them in and charge them back up? That is actually harder on a lithium ion battery than, keeping it below, above a 80% state of discharge or 20% charge. So that's interesting because I'm used to hearing the lithium ion battery industry talk about how they're so much better than lead acid because you can deeply discharge lithium ion compared to lead acid. But as we talk about in our residential off-grid class, there's a spectrum within lead acid batteries, and some can be much more deeply discharged than others, and that spectrum continues on up into lithium ion technologies. What we're seeing here is a limitation of 2 hours on fully discharging the lithium ion battery. And Tesla, we saw the same thing. They put 13.5 kilowatt hours on a 5 kilowatt inverter, which throttles the discharge rate. So there's the C over 2 refers to a 2-hour discharge rate. C over 6 is a 6-hour discharge rate. C over 20 is a 20-hour discharge rate. 2C would be a 30-minute discharge rate. And even this higher end lithium ion battery that lasts twice as long as a Tesla Powerwall is limited by its ability to quickly discharge. And furthermore, the life is improved substantially if it doesn't fully discharge. So, lithium ion batteries are not, the end all in energy storage technologies. And anyway, we get absorb voltages and recharge voltages, and generally there's two things I want to point out here. First off is the industry has nickname voltages: 24 volts, 48 volts, 120, 240 electric service, but the actual voltage within those classes isn't strictly 48 volts or strictly 24 volts, and that can get confusing to non-electricians because it could give you a false impression that there's a wide voltage range for these devices, but actually you get over voltage and it's like bursting the skin of a water balloon. Just go a little bit too far, and what was acceptable is now critically damaging. Lithium ion batteries are sealed batteries, and sealed batteries, if you took the same technology and were to make an unsealed battery, apples to apples comparison, the sealed batteries cannot be as aggressively charged as the unsealed batteries. Lithium ion batteries are sealed batteries, and so when you program a battery inverter that can accommodate a variety of voltage options, the 48 volt voltage settings for a sealed battery are always less than the voltage settings of an unsealed battery. And so actually unsealed flooded lead acid might have a higher voltage range and voltage tolerance than lithium ion. And that's really a moot point. I'm at in my practice where if it's an off-grid residential setting, I'm saying go with used lithium ion. and for commercial solar peakers, we're going with lithium ion. So I'm not going to talk too much more about lead acid. Um, whereas lithium ion does not have a good response when you're doing faster than a 2-hour discharge, which is why the manufacturers limit it to that. Lead acid, it's more like a 6 hours. Once you get a discharge rate that's faster than that, you really start losing all of your electricity to discharge inefficiency, and you don't. And the result is not just expensive electricity. The result is the battery cannot power what you're actually trying to supply. So lithium ion is entry level, also called lithium cobalt. Lithium iron phosphate costs twice as much and lasts twice as long. The problem with lithium iron phosphate is there's only one supplier globally, and so it's not it's an expense it is an expensive technology. Um, So I don't know. I don't think that the one supplier globally is as important as I thought it was when I was making the quiz, but it is one of the quiz questions. Um, Now we're looking at a kind of more cutting edge battery called lithium titanate. And lithium titanate it's a more durable anode. And so instead of, lithium iron phosphate is a more durable anode, a more durable battery. And so instead of, the Tesla Powerwall is rated, for, of full cycles, maybe 5 or 6 years. Um, Lithium iron phosphate, you get, instead of getting a 3,800 cycle rating, you get a 10,000 cycle rating. Lithium titanate is an even higher tier. Instead of getting a 10,000 cycle rating, it's saying if you're discharging me to 80% or less, then we'll be doing 30,000 cycles. And it's being discharged. They're calling it a half C, or that's saying effective. They're the same thing as saying calling it 2C. They're saying a 30-minute charge discharge. So the higher tier you go in your battery technologies, and this stuff starts to be 4 times as expensive and very experimental. So I'm not recommending lithium titanate, but there are companies out there who are even claiming that their lithium titanate technology is not even, they would not define it as a battery. They would define it as a supercapacitor called kilowatt hour labs. And then the battery experts that I know of look at kilowatt hour labs and say, no, this is a very good battery, but it's a lithium titanate battery. There's even fewer suppliers of lithium titanate than there is of lithium iron phosphate. But and again, highly experimental, because there aren't batteries out there that have actually lasted 30,000 cycles out in the field. But the more expensive and rare the coatings are of the anodes, the longer the batteries last. And but the on the other hand, the longer the batteries last, the higher quality they are, and they're charging accordingly. It doesn't really result in a cheaper battery, other than the advantage you get from having to install it once and hopefully never again. So it's an emerging technology. Now, what I think is funny about, say, comparing lithium iron phosphate to lithium titanate is when I look at the lead acid battery, I look at the middle of the road lead acid to the top shelf lead acid. There is a huge difference in weight between the middle of the road lead acid and the much heavier, the much more dense but equivalently sized storage capacity industrial lead acid. And it's the same thing, like lithium titanate. We're seeing it, um, you know, it it's weighing more than anyway. There's other points to be making, but generally an increase in quality comes with an increase of weight. These batteries are heavy. Um, when I get industrial flooded lead acid, the batteries themselves are weighing 800 pounds each, broken up into 12-volt battery packs. Um, so these lithium ion commercial batteries are, well, we'll see some pictures of some products, but they're kind of being stored in industrial air conditioned shipping containers on the sides of buildings. Lithium ion batteries are heavy. Batteries are heavy, is what I'm really trying to say. We might come back to these data sheets. So kind of what we were talking about on discharge capabilities, lithium ion has a much greater range than lead acid. Lead acid is really something that should be discharged in hours rather than minutes. Lithium ion, it does have a bottom limit to its rapidly discharged rate. And then there are technologies, some electrical like supercapacitors, or some mechanical like flywheels that can even be more rapidly charged and discharged than lithium ion. And so I know in elevators they use regenerative electrical storage based on flywheels, because that elevator is a large amount of weight on a pulley. It's kind of perfect for regenerative braking, and they use flywheels because that elevator is traversing the height of the building within a matter of seconds rather than 15 minutes or 2 hours. So there are uses where lithium ion is not the right technology to supply even more niche applications. And then another technology called flow batteries are more suited towards lower rates of discharge. So there's other battery technologies that are more focused on being the base load storage. So lithium ion doesn't need to be the full storage, end-all storage solution to all storage solutions, but it will be the dominant one. Right now, we have more hydro storage than other forms of storage, but I imagine that's going to change. And so, putting these different battery technologies, we got the Tesla Powerwall 2, and that's rated for 3,500 cycles at an 80% depth of discharge. And how do we get that? Tesla doesn't give us this cycle rating at an 80% depth of discharge, but they give us a 37,800 kilowatt hour warranty when we're keeping it at an 80% depth of discharge cycle. So, you can divide by, it's a 5 kilowatt, output. So how many cycles down to 80% and back? You get 37,800. 80% of that, 5 kilowatt hours per cycle, gets you to a 3,500 cycle. Lithium iron phosphate, much longer, but again, that comes with a pretty much in proportion cost increase. Same thing when you go from lithium iron to lithium titanate, and then there's supercapacitors, which are way more per kilowatt hour. You would never use them unless you have to for very specialized like medical electronics. can deliver even more cycles with even faster discharge rates. Okay, so the Tesla Powerwall, being a lower end lithium cobalt, will actually say we're a 5 kilowatt output, but you can use us in a burst mode where we can discharge more than 5 kilowatts. We just can't do it continuously. So 5 kilowatts is if you want to use us for, the full 2.5 hours, we'll deliver you 5 kilowatts. But if you have a load that surges, we can surge with it. And so we can, get up to, 7.5 kW for 20 seconds. And the lithium iron phosphate, being a better battery technology, can do even larger surges for even greater periods of time. And likewise, as the quality of the internals of the batteries use more durable and more expensive materials, you get up to continuous discharge rates that, could be, a 30-minute discharge rate for the battery. And why that's interesting is especially with a commercial solar peaker, you may not need more than 30 minutes of storage, but during that time, the economics of buying a top shelf battery for 30 minutes versus a bottom shelf battery for 2.5 hours, it may turn out to be about the same. And that might make it even harder for the designer. Do you go with a more established, market-proven technology that's cheaper and has about the same payback, or do you go with the shiniest object in the bunch that ultimately might be a better deal? That really depends upon the risk tolerance of the client. Tesla, it might surprise you to know, is kind of the low end supplier of lithium ion. And what they're saying is, we're going to use, what we think is the most cost effective, optimal battery technology. And we're going to focus on like proprietary electrolytes to optimize the value of that particular tech. Lithium iron and lithium titanate have, a little bit murkier supply chains. So you're really being much more experimental and riskier when you are kind of pursuing that upgrade. Yeah, we'll talk about charge controller systems they have their own slides on the program, so we'll talk about that. There's a different battery technology than lithium iron phosphate or lithium titanate or supercapacitors that I kind of came across after I did this analysis. But it turns out that I think this is going to be the winning chemistry for commercial, which is a lithium nickel metal cadmium. It's called lithium NMC. And the reason why I look at that is we're going to review the technical specs and look at it compared to lithium ion and look at it compared to lithium iron phosphate and see how it kind of better matches what we're trying to do with these batteries at the commercial level. And then what's backed up by that is I usually use industrial flooded lead acid and for my off-grid homes. And talking with that battery manufacturer, who's the third largest battery manufacturer globally, when are they going to release their version of lithium ion? Their first lithium ion product is going to be a lithium NMC product, which is what Delta is already delivering as a commercial solution. So there's other players in this market using lithium NMC. So I'm going to kind of review some commercial components that go into a commercial solar battery. Now here we have a power conditioning system with adjustable power factors, and that's starting to be a major concern for utilities. The problem with solar being so uh, closely matching whatever the grid is that when the grid goes through power surges, that might not even be the solar array's fault. But then you combine that with the intermittency of solar, say on a particularly bad, partly cloudy day, the inability to control the power factor of solar makes any power factor issues that are on the grid worse. And so the utility being able to remotely control and adjust the power factor of the systems, say, dumbing it down a little bit on partly cloudy days, can resolve a lot of utility issues without really impacting the economics of this type of system for sure. So adjustable power factors is kind of like a standard feature now, even of residential inverters. Then you have a choice between schedulable demand or more intelligent kind of force feedback controls. So more intelligent force feedback controls are the preferable way to do it, because the inverter has some important decisions to make, when they're seeing power load coming at it. Is do they retreat a few steps and not spend as much energy out of the battery bank, or do they do everything they possibly can not to let any space invader touch the bottom of the map? So do they try and fully discharge their battery no matter what, or do they dial it back some? And that's the day to day. Now, as the days turn into weeks and months, throughout the month, the battery inverter can look back and say, you know what, last Tuesday was a terrible defeat. I only got the demand down to 65 kilowatts. And so I'm not going to defend my previous marking point. I was trying to get down to 51 kilowatts. I only got down to 65 kilowatts. And so now for the rest of the month, I'm only going to defend the 65 kilowatt threshold and not run my battery as hard the rest of the month, cut my losses. So an intelligent um, battery monitoring system can make those decisions, or even look ahead at the next day's weather and apply different modes of operation. And so that sounds a little like futuristic, but I just want to, in my like, I'm running an open source home automation software, and one of the inputs put into this software called Home Assistant is the weather. And so in my home automation platform, I have weather data, whether it's going to be a sunny day or a partly cloudy day or a cloudy day. And I'm running energy automations based off time of day, but that could also be configured off weather. I'm on a time of use rate structure mode, so I have certain devices turning off during peak rates and turning back on when that's done. I have an off-grid customer using this to control their demand management as a function of their power consumption. There are battery like intelligence companies focused on not just PQ control on how quickly to discharge the battery under a surge in electrical demand, but other maybe more important factors to consider, specializing in microgrids and stuff like that. Or the easy way to do it, the way that anybody can control, is to kind of oversize the batteries a bit and then look at the previous electric load schedule and say, okay, well, I'm pretty certain that I can program the battery to hit these month by month demand factors. So when we go back into our design example, let's see, where did that go? There we go. When we go back into building the model, I improve this zoom. What I've programmed into my basic, stupid, Excel spreadsheet is, different demand reductions. So I've gone and determined that February, the month with the highest electrical load, is going to be the only month of the year that I'm above 51 kilowatts in load. And then, so with the same battery capacity, I have all these different levels. And I say, okay, well, here's my battery capacity. Here's the smallest size. And in December, I get down to -8. And so what I'm going to do is say, okay, well, in December, my max load can't be 52, one, because that takes me out of capacity in my battery bank. I'm going to say it's going to be 52. And it adjusts my model, which takes a while because it's calculating, every day of the year. It says, okay, well, we're actually down to -3. So maybe December is my worst month. So I'm just going to go up to, say, 53. And so, what we're doing is just taking a model that's based off of month by month tiers. In February, based on historical usage, how aggressively can I run my battery bank? And then I have a column that subtracts how much power is in the bank versus what the actual consumption is. And we're tweaking this to see every month how aggressively can I run my battery bank. And so, in January, in December, we've honed in on December, taking this 92 kilowatt load down to 53 kilowatts is going to leave me with 1 kilowatt hour left in my tank. Now, that's not very much. I'm probably still oversized from here. But with that same battery, I might be able to get down my facility demand to 35 kW in January. Yeah, so I'm still good. My lowest battery level is still fine. And so how aggressive can I be in these models? So getting the January load down to 30 kW is possible, and 35 kW in February was a little bit too aggressive. And so if we're not so conservative on our settings, and we're always trying to keep a little bit left in the tank, based on historical usage, which is not always the best, but we can only do what we can only be a little more conservative if it's not going to happen. But we can actually start assigning month by month demand targets, and then looking at is that even possible? So here now in June and July, we've gotten our new demand down to like 12 kW or 18 kW, but we're at the very bottom of that plateau. So going even further than that, you might as well take the whole building off grid. But then you're running the battery all the time. So that's not really going to get you, a better system size. All right, let's get back on track. Why we took that kind of segue is to say that there's menus in these battery inverter, battery management systems, where you are literally putting a monitor on the main electric service panel to say how much power is coming into that facility, and scheduling literal power levels to say when the building's power levels are above this amount, turn the battery on. Or there are more advanced options out there depending on whose battery system you use. Here's a term, the battery module. This is what National Electric Code refers to as batteries. In the solar industry is the same way. What you think of as a solar panel, the solar industry thinks of as a solar module, which is an assembly of solar cells. A battery module is an assembly of battery cells. And so, when you're buying a 12 volt lithium ion battery or a 48 volt lithium ion battery, they're not naturally 12 volts or 48 volts. The manufacturer has packaged them into a module to be within the range of a standard 12 volt or 48 volt electrical device like a charge controller. So battery module is a code term. It's a little blurry. Maybe we'll pull up their website. But what they have are these battery 48 volt battery modules that kind of stack up in a cabinet. So at the residential level, you can find lithium ion inverters that are actually mounted to a server. They have little server rack attachments, like a corporate web server. They have batteries that are intended to be mounted similar to server controls. And what's nice is you can put them in cabinets, and commercial batteries, you have to guard them from accidental contact. So the best way to guard these kinds of batteries is to put them in their own cabinet. And there's airflow requirements for battery spacing as well. And so if you're putting them inside a building, putting them in a cabinet and then having an air management system just within the cabinet reduces the required amount of real estate that you need for ventilation. So you can just ventilate the cabinet and not the whole room that the batteries are in, depending on the cabinet quality. Each individual cell needs a manager. And so these battery management systems, there's high-end intelligent battery management systems that can do all those, weather prediction and PQ, force feedback discharge controls. What we're really talking about when we say a battery management system is basically the part that regulates the voltage within the battery cells to make sure that they're not overcharged. When you apply too much voltage to a lithium-ion battery, it can pop. It can break the battery, and so battery management is like a charge controller or voltage regulator. So all these batteries are put into the cabinets, and cabinets are put into air-conditioned shipping containers that go alongside the building. I guess that's one way to do it. So this is a lithium NMC battery on the Delta website. If we look at it for too much longer, I'll just pull it up online so the image is a little more clear. But what we see is this is a high DC voltage cabinet, 650 to 800 volts, which is interesting because solar voltage on commercial buildings, you're often dealing with 600 to 1,000 volt systems. And so Delta is kind of assuming and building this battery cabinet to take advantage of a higher voltage platform. And the reason is you are more efficient when you don't just skip around to different voltages willy-nilly. So if you have a high voltage solar array, feeding that power into a high voltage battery is technically should be more efficient than stepping it down to a lower voltage. And our buildings, commercial buildings, sometimes they're at 208 volts, sometimes they're at 480 volts. So for a variety of reasons, staying at a higher voltage is better. Lithium ion has a higher voltage naturally than pound for pound than lead acid as well. So there's a reason for higher voltage platforms, and that can drive down your balance of system material costs. So they're saying, okay, one cabinet, which is assembly of their modules, is 44 kilowatt hours, or we have a higher version that's 50 kilowatt hours. They're giving a discharge current of 300 amps. So let's do a little bit of math here. What we're looking at is a 43, let's go with their fastest, cheapest battery. Their 43 kilowatt hour battery. And so if it's on for at 300 amps, well, that's its discharge current. Let's do this. Let's look a little more into the spec sheets before we complete this one. One thing I want to point out is the cycles. This is a more expensive battery than lithium cobalt, but it's, lithium cobalt had 3,500 cycle rating. Lithium iron had 10,000 cycles. This battery has similar cycles to lithium cobalt, but it costs more. So that at first glance, that doesn't sound like a very good deal to have a more expensive battery, rated for fewer cycles or similar cycles as the cheaper one. They have different shipping containers for it. So I probably need to update these graphics. They must not have stretched well enough. Okay, so this is what makes what I was trying to say a little more apparent. So this is a shipping container. This is a 20-foot shipping container's worth of batteries. So now we're talking commercial product. It has about 500 kilowatt hours worth of capacity with a 1 megawatt output maximum power. And this one has, 3 times as much capacity and twice as much output power. Well, if I have a half a megawatt hour of capacity and 1 megawatt of output power, what that means is I could fully discharge the batteries in 30 minutes. And remember what we learned about entry-level lithium cobalt, it cannot be discharged faster, continuously, for 2 hours. And so, the lithium, nickel, metal, cadmium, the lithium NMC battery, let's assume that it does cost, twice as much as entry-level lithium cobalt for the same amount of energy output and the same amount of cycles and the same amount of life. The only difference between the two is the lithium NMC is 4 times as fast as the lithium cobalt. Where that really comes into play are, and we're going back a few slides, but our loads like this, where the load, that spikiest peak that you're trying to level, is only, a 15-minute or 30-minute load. If your load that you're trying to level is already 2.5 hours or longer, then lithium cobalt is just fine. You're getting into a little bit more base load leveling, because you're trying to level longer loads. But if you're only trying to level short loads, being 4 times as fast means that you could have a much smaller battery, to level this load. And so if the battery costs twice as much, but the load is only 15 minutes instead of 2 hours, that's where lithium NMC is really coming into play. And what that kind of load might very well be is a cloud passing over a solar array. Turns the solar array off for 15 minutes, clouds over, solar array zooms back on. You buy just 15 minutes worth of storage on a lithium NMC battery. And so that's where, Delta's product, and then Hawker is the other one. They seem to be looking at that rapid rate of discharge of lithium NMC compared to entry level lithium cobalt being better suited for smaller battery banks to target super spiky loads without getting into the price range of the experimental stuff like ultracapacitors or lithium titanate. So I talked to someone anonymously who has installed the Delta system to kind of see how they were using this, this configuration of a battery pack that's sized enough to, fully discharge half-an-hour loads, and what they actually end up doing with it. And so this one says, we put a 250 kilowatt output on a 48 kilowatt hour battery pack. Again, this is because the inverter electronics are not the most expensive part of this budget. The batteries are the most expensive part of the budget. And so what they're saying is, we need to even try and push the batteries beyond their capability. Maybe we need to pull up the Delta spec sheet and look at it a little closer. But so what they're saying is the Delta system can even burst not just up to 2C, a 30-minute discharge, but can burst up to 6C. And so, there are examples of companies out in the field already implementing, lithium NMC just to target 15-minute to 30-minute loads. So there was already solar on site, and what they say is, they see it as a great way to shave off 50 to 100 kW of peak load demand. So I'm thinking back to that Colorado dentist office, and I'm like, well, why don't they just turn the heat on earlier? That seems like that would have as good an impact as anything else and not cost nearly as much money. And to some extent, that's true. Digital load controls are another way to accomplish this, which might be more cost effective, or maybe not. Maybe the air conditioner manufacturers don't want you to monkey around with their systems, and maybe you don't run into that issue with batteries. And if it's an acceptable payback, there's other values that batteries have to offer, yada yada. So I asked him, I was like, why don't you do stage startups? Why don't you not turn all your devices on at once and instead spread it out a little to reduce peak demand? And, what he said is there's a few reasons. Facility managers aren't dumb, and many are already doing stage startups. And so they're looking for what else they can do. B, there are uh, loads out there that are difficult to control. If you're on an assembly line and you need to run a machine, you're not going to check, okay, do we need to wait 5 minutes before we can run this thing because of our varying energy use? So there's only so much you can control. And then they had, device specific reasons to only need demand management for a very, very short period of time. So that could be an electric heater that only turns on for 1 hour, but you're trying to heat the whole building. That could be a cattle ranch application where you're running a feeder in the early morning to feed the livestock, but then that's the only device that's being used for the rest of the day. Or maybe a fallback for when you have a very large solar array, but you have to have some insurance for demand savings on a partly cloudy day. And then here they're looking at it, using it basically as a building level backup power supply. So the problem with the Tesla Powerwall is it's a 13 kilowatt hour battery, but you can't use it all at once. You can only use 5 kilowatts worth of it. And so, what they're saying is, we can, even though we're only, a battery that's half that size, you can still use us, in a complete manner. You can get more power out from us during that critical time period. If a power outage only lasts, 1 minute or 15 minutes, you don't need a 4 hour battery to get through that crisis. And so, these smaller batteries that you can get more output capacity of can fill a lot of needs and be very responsive as well. So looking at this this NCM, lithium NCM battery, we're saying, it's given us some discharge rates. So there's nominal energy of 200 watt hours. A continuous output of 114 amps, but then a 2 minute output of 228 amps and an instantaneous for less than 10 seconds output of 285 amps. Okay, so what does that mean? Let's take I think I lost my calculator. There we go. If our battery is 220 watt hours, and it's, volt times an amp is a watt, so we're saying it's a 3.7 volt battery. That means there's 60 amp hours in it. And so if we're drawing 140 on, twice that many, if we're drawing 114 amps out of it, what it's saying is it'll drain over 30 minutes. And what it's actually saying is, for shorter times, instead of just having a 30-minute discharge rate, you could apply almost three times as much amperage to it. And, it'll power that load for 10 seconds. So it could surge to that amount. And then over a short time, less than 2 minutes, it could surge to 228 amps. And so, on a load that if it didn't have so much efficiency loss, it would be able to power for 15 minutes. Instead, it can only power it for 2 minutes. But at the same time, if that load is a 2 minute load, you're not losing a terrible amount. So what I'm saying is these things have crazy burst speeds that are much faster than low end uh, lithium cobalt, such as the Tesla Powerwall. So there's really in terms of top shelf lithium ion batteries that are on the market, not the experimental stuff that maybe one startup is doing. And there are those startups out there, and some of them, like Kilowatt Labs, starting to get some real good momentum. But as far as the standard technologies that are being implemented that are beyond lithium, the Tesla Powerwall or the LG Chem battery, the next step up, you're really looking at a choice between lithium iron phosphate or lithium nickel metal. I don't know, I'm running a blank. It's not cadmium, calcium. Looking at the differences between them, about the same voltages. The amp hour capacity is about twice that on NMC versus lithium iron. But the difference is the lithium iron phosphate has longer cycles, and so we have a faster lithium ion battery for more money compared to entry level, or we have a more longer lasting option that has about the same speed. And so there are studies to say, where are we going with lithium iron technology or lithium ion technology? And we're still in the advent of lithium ion. Even the top shelf, most experimental lithium technologies today are projected to be surpassed in years to come. Looking at the parts and pieces of lithium ion, I thought that this was pretty interesting. The electrodes themselves, not the electrolyte, or the build quality of the module or the labor or overhead, but the actual electrode and anode, which are kind of like the opposite ends of the end zone for opposing teams. They're where the electrons are passing through the battery, the most important part of the electron transfer, represent over half the cost of the battery. And the anodes in particular are subject to degradation, and so the coatings of these anodes can the degradation of a battery is like barnacles covering the hull of a ship. And when enough of those barnacles completely cover the hull, electrons can't get through anymore. And so the question becomes, how do you prevent those barnacles from coating the anode? And that's where you get into more expensive rare earth metals. And so, like, Tesla is currently buying its lithium cobalt for around 130 kilowatt hours, and that is part of their strategy of having a lot of demand for these batteries through electric vehicles. And really, the naysayers of Tesla have always said, just make batteries because that's what we really want. So, Tesla does not have a volume problem when it comes to batteries. And so they should be, they're using, not the top shelf batteries, and they're using large purchasing volumes. And so they should be kind of the leader of how cheap does it get? And I would say that this is just the raw battery cost too. When you add in the inverter electronics, charge controllers, and stuff, that goes on up. And so we should see economies of scale in commercial solar battery components where you can buy cabinets of batteries and the inverters are just one smaller part of that. When I price used lithium ion batteries, which come out of like wrecked electric vehicles, the electric vehicle might be 2 years old, gets in a wreck, is totaled. The batteries are still, what they are. That price per kilowatt hour of used lithium ions coming down to below $100 a kilowatt hour. So I'd say new, just the battery component. I'd say Tesla's at their mark. And studies generally in an exponential growth market are going to overstate the costs, but the lithium NMC price range, is more expensive than the low end lithium cobalt. And so what Tesla might say in response to Delta saying lithium NMC is great, there's nothing better for your 15-minute loads. Tesla might say, well, if you buy our battery instead, we can sell you 2 to 3 times as much capacity for the same budget. And so, the 15-minute load issue is being resolved by having a larger battery to draw out of. And a true energy theorist might say the answer is to have both. Have lithium NMC for the spikiest of loads and have lower end lithium cobalt for other loads, and then have flow batteries for base loads. And at that point, you get back to the real world and say there's not any companies supplying those kinds of solutions outside of small battery specialist incubators. And so when we look at like the cost per kilowatt hour of these various technologies, you're looking at the raw material cost of Tesla being $130 a kilowatt hour. The caveat being you're usually having to buy into the rest of the Tesla ecosystem to access their raw costs. Unlike calling up a market-leading lithium nickel NMC supplier, of which your global battery companies are just now getting into this market space, you're likely to be quoted $600 a kilowatt hour or more for the higher-end batteries. Whereas lithium iron phosphate is a little bit more commonplace and a little bit cheaper. So, we talked about the difference between, lithium NMC being the faster battery, lithium iron phosphate being a longer lasting battery. And, what that means is they have different purposes. And then you get into even more expensive experimental technologies. Like, I know I can go onto eBay and find a vendor who's claiming to sell me lithium titanate batteries for $530 a kilowatt hour, but it's a much murkier supply chain than you can find quality brand name battery manufacturers to stand behind other kinds of lithium ion. This is more experimental. And battery pricing is dropping. Still not very fast yet. I don't think we're over the edge of the cliff quite yet. In the past year, we've had other costs kind of added into the supply chain through trade policy. Okay, so this is a chart, and we're getting into more fundamental components. This is a chart where I plotted the the cycle curves for how many cycles you get for what depth of discharge out of the battery. And so I plotted a renewable flooded lead acid and a premium flooded lead acid. And these are the kinds of batteries that are currently marketed as good for off grid solar owners. Deep cycle marina batteries that are wonderful to charge and discharge, is the marketing. And then this yellow line is the technology that's used in most high end industrial forklift batteries. And it's actually called industrial flooded lead acid to say, look, we're going to cost twice as much as that renewable, lead acid, but we're also going to have twice as many cycles. And so, we're the technology that the big boys use when it comes to lead acid. And then up here is the Tesla Powerwall 2 with its lithium ion cycle. And basically what I wanted to say is, the difference between lead acid and lithium ion is not as great as it seems. The top tier lead acid is more like a bottom tier lithium ion than a mid tier lead acid. And similarly, there are other battery technologies that we've looked at, like lithium iron phosphate, that would be even further up this graph. So let's talk about coupling and adding how to charge these batteries. And this really breaks down between two kind of fundamental decisions. You want to do DC charging of the batteries, or do you want to do AC charging of the batteries? And technically the DC side should win out this battle, but in reality, AC charging is often going to be cheaper and easier. And furthermore, for this kind of application, it doesn't really matter. But let's learn about the differences, because we're here for education. So when I have a DC coupled system, my energy is coming straight from the solar array and going into the battery before coming out of the battery and into the load. And so, if the batteries are full and the load is on, the electricity kind of just flows across it. But regardless, it's flowing through one and then two processors of that electricity. The first is called a charge controller, and it's called that instead of an inverter, because the charge controller just does DC to DC, and the inverter does DC to AC. But they accomplish the same thing, in that they regulate the voltage between the variable voltage of the solar array and what needs to be a much more stable voltage of the battery bank. And so actually in the solar array, we have very popular systems, especially rooftop systems, have little voltage regulators behind every single box on the roof before coming down to the inverter on the side of the building. And so there's voltage stabilization going on in most popular rooftop systems that's code driven. The National Electric Code on rooftop systems now requires little boxes and controllers to go behind every panel on the rooftop, more or less. And those little boxes and panels that provide, shutdown capability during power outages almost uniformly provide voltage regulation and stabilization. And so if you're already, taking what should be a variable solar voltage, but stabilizing it coming off the rooftop, running it into a battery bank at that output voltage level really should not be that expensive to do. The only issue with it is a lack of product availability. So before lithium ion batteries, we didn't really need, have a use for huge battery banks, and net metering policy encouraged kind of a batteryless solar platform. So a lot of money was put into developing solar inverters that, do DC to AC and don't need batteries. And not a lot of money was put into, battery inverters and DC charge controllers, as well as, integrated systems that combined everything together for maximum cost effectiveness. And furthermore, you might already have a job site that has already built out a solar array and already has its own inverter already. And so a much easier connection platform is AC coupling, where the solar array and the battery bank are on their own independent inverters. They don't share the same inverter. Now, which is better or which is worse? I would not evaluate DC coupling versus AC coupling in terms of system efficiency. Like, what? This is an energy product, isn't efficiency the most important thing? Actually, no. In a commercial solar peaker, reducing peak demand is the most important thing. And, if we have a solar array at all, it's probably going to generate a surplus of worthless energy. And so I don't really care, about the efficiency of the inverter, because, that energy loss is negligible. I'm only focused on demand. So if even though a charge controller to the battery and then out of the battery to the load is technically the more energy efficient step, and why is it more energy efficient? Well, this power has to come out the inverter and then go up through the battery inverter and then back out the battery inverter. So it's a 1, 2, 3-step process, whereas with the charge controllers, it's less processing. Less processing usually means higher system efficiency, but not always. I mean, the dedicated solar inverters that are batteryless are now very cheap. And they're also very good and very efficient, because then there's been a lot of money behind them. So, just overall, a dedicated solar inverter is going to be cheaper than a battery inverter that can be connected to both solar and batteries, simply because of manufacturer gains to date. And the ability to separate the system on 2 different inverters instead of one inverter for the entire system means that the batteries and the solar array can be located at different points on the facility. You might have the batteries next to the side of the building and the solar array out in the field, or the solar array on top of the roof and the batteries closer to the point of interconnection. So AC coupling is a common solution out of just site planning necessity. The one advantage that DC coupling has on AC coupling is more of a backup power and emergency issue. And I'm not so sure that on these kinds of systems you want to be pushing the emergency button too hard, because even National Electric Code draws a line between emergency power systems and backup power systems. Emergency power systems are more critical than backup power systems. But let's say you were designing an emergency power system for a hurricane, um, and let's assume you had a gas generator, but you ran out of gas, and the roads are awful, and everyone's buying gas, so you have no gas. The most commonly made argument about DC coupling is that a batteryless solar array needs to be able to detect the grid in order to turn on and function. It's a safety feature. Furthermore, it can't. It's so basic inside that inverter that it does not have the parts that a battery inverter has. And so it really can't do anything until the grid comes online. And so the problem is if the sun goes down, the solar array turns off, and then let's assume you mismanage your electricity and run out of electricity in your batteries, and the battery inverter turns off. Well, then the sun comes back up and your solar array wants to turn on, but it can't because the battery inverter won't turn on, and it can't because it didn't see a signal from the battery inverter, and it can't because the batteries are dead. And so you have a solar array on site with batteries, but because you went with AC coupling, your whole system is worthless. That's the argument against it. And it's not true because you can program the battery inverter to have a reserve capacity, or you could have a backup gas generator for that specific purpose. So, this is not a fatal flaw that it's made out to be in some solar articles. But it is an advantage of the DC charge controller being able to be directly powered by the solar array to power up the batteries. So, DC charge controllers are better for emergencies. We're not really talking about emergency systems. We're talking about, trying to make commercial batteries economic through peak demand management. But I guess it's important to understand the nuance. The point of it is, you can do both. You can have some DC coupled batteries and some AC coupled batteries, and like the Delta system, accepts inputs for both. It's just really a matter of what electronics you want to use. So you can always use a backup generator. And so DC coupling, I use in some off-grid systems, although, there really is a huge difference between the availability of DC charge controllers versus the availability of AC solar or battery inverters. So I think it's easiest to stick with AC coupling for commercial solar projects, unless you're going with an integrated solution like Delta, where the whole system's coming from one supplier and they already have it set up to be DC coupled. I certainly don't think it's a mistake to do AC coupling. I don't think there's, a compelling reason to rule it out. There are some solar companies out there that are specializing in piecing these kinds of systems together. So this is a company called Pika, and what Pika does is they make a voltage regulator for the whole circuit of panels, which I think is a great solution. Unfortunately, National Electric Code has ruled that you really need to limit voltage even within the solar array to be so small that you really have to be taking your controls down to one or two solar panels. So they made a product to do the whole circuit, which I think is wonderful and safe and fine, but it's a little bit ambiguous or unambiguous even. That's a hard product now to put on a roof and be code compliant. But them and another company called Solar Edge, and there's a few other companies out there. They put these voltage regulators on the back of the solar modules, and by having a stable DC circuit before you get to the battery inverter, it makes it very easy to add on a battery. And so when you're buying a battery inverter, there may be some DC coupling options. If there aren't any, I wouldn't worry about it too much. The commercial equivalent to Pica that I know of is a company called Amped. And I don't think they really market themselves well enough. I think they have a pretty unique. They're like Solar Edge for commercial industrial, where here's their solar string optimizers, and these are basically voltage regulators, and they got high voltage regulators, that can handle 1500-volt circuits, 1000-volt circuits, 750-volt circuits, 600-volt circuits. And so it's really not that difficult to design a higher voltage lithium ion battery bank if you're a company like Delta. All you need is a inverter that has the same output as your electrical service for 480 volt Y Delta 208. Those are possible. And the question is, do you want to get another inverter for the solar array, or do you want to tie in the batteries on the DC side through a charge controller? And there are products out there to regulate the voltage, to give you voltage stability on the DC side, but it is often no more cost effective than AC coupling today. Not from a technical reason, but just due to lack of manufacturer attention. The switch gear of interconnecting all these systems together can get a little complicated. But what I included this is a residential battery inverter system. And this particular inverter is stackable, which means you can take one inverter and daisy chain it to the next inverter. And not all battery inverters are like this, but in this case, this is a 7 kilowatt inverter. You can daisy chain two of them together to make 14 kilowatts. You can daisy chain 10 of them together to make 70 kilowatts. I think this particular platform goes up to 200 kW. And so I think why that's interesting is you can start small with a stackable inverter architecture and just put a 7 kilowatt battery inverter and on 7 kilowatt hours of lithium, nickel, metal, cadmium, and then if it works out, scale up the system to larger and larger quantities. So what's going on in this one line diagram? Here's a grid connection. And we're coming in at the top of the bus bar. There's another service panel here, and if we follow its lines, it's coming in at the bottom of this bus bar. And here we either have a grid feed and some breakers that individually feed back to the inverter. And so this will say, okay, well, these breakers will isolate me from the grid. But they'll also directly connect to the grid. And so this battery inverter is capable of being grid tied and backfeeding the grid. That electricity from the inverter or also from the grid can go in and come out and power the critical load panel. But if there were a power outage, you could either manually or automatically flick this switch, and cut off the grid connection entirely. And then there's a separate output. Where's that going? That's going over here, and over the top. A separate output on its own transfer switch that can come in and feed the switchgear to protect the critical load panel. And so there's the ability for automatic transfer to protect critical loads. And so that might be one thing to consider when adding these projects to a facility. Is it would be a really good time to install critical load panels for backup power so that the systems have some use during power outages as well as during grid outages. And why would you do a critical load panel versus powering the whole building? The answer is the critical load panels are protected automatically without you having to pony up for the cost of an automatic transfer switch that's the size of your building. So I'm not even completely sure what that would look like for a 1600 amp building. But so the other way is maybe a manual transfer switch for something that large to implement a true disaster scenario. And most building owners aren't trying to design their buildings to be emergency shelters through terrible disasters. Other things on this line diagram, we got the battery bank being tied into a DC bus, and then this DC bus going back and landing on the DC bus of the inverter. So what's interesting about this is we have a solar array that's running at 600 volts, and this battery voltage for this particular system is a lower voltage, 48 volts. And then the output capacity of the inverter up on the AC side is 120, 240. And so here we have a DC bus bar that is on a 48 volt standard, and then another DC bus bar that's on a 48 volt standard. But the DC voltage coming out of the charge controllers are on their own breakers and disconnects at a higher 600 voltage level. And so, the switch gears of these systems are going to have multiple bus bars for different voltage levels as you go from one piece of equipment to the next. And I have to say that's another reason where at the commercial level, the higher voltage of lithium ion becomes an advantage. At the residential level, these 48 volt battery banks result in, when you're trying to power 50 kilowatts worth of power through a 48 voltage, a volt times an amp is a watt. And so, let's pull up our calculator again. And we're looking at, let's say we're trying to pull 50,000 watts, 50 kilowatts through a 48 volt battery bank. You're looking at 1,000 amps. You're looking at incredibly thick copper cable. And so by the time you get into 100 kilowatt loads or 200 kilowatt loads, there's no way a 48 volt platform can support that. And so most of these lithium ion banks are already going to be at higher voltages. It's not to say you can't do some small demand management at 48 kilowatts, but most often you won't. You'll be using a higher voltage platform. And so most dedicated lithium ion solutions are starting at around 380 volts, whereas most retrofit solutions might still have 48 volt options for kind of with residential systems in mind. We talked about the difference between DC and AC coupling. We are approaching the end of our time. So tomorrow, what we're going to talk about is we're going to get further, along in some technical discussion. We're going to spend some time looking at more on modeling, and then we'll talk about some community solar design. So we'll, talk a little bit more about solar design and construction issues. Then we will, increase our knowledge of community solar financing, and then explore some modeling in a little bit greater detail. So I think that is it. I'm going to give a brief glance at the quiz to make sure that I covered everything. Most commercial demand charges are under 20 kilowatts, and let's see. The last thing we probably should cover before we go is just calculating some demand charge savings. And so, we will advance this a little bit further tomorrow. But if you got a $5 per kilowatt demand charge, and you are load leveling 10 kilowatts of demand for the month, your savings is going to be $50. And that sounds obvious. Sorry for my chicken scratch, but that doesn't matter if you level that demand for 1 hour for the entire month, 1 hour for every single day, or 4 hours a day. The kilowatt demand is your peak demand reduction for the entire month. And so if you have to run the battery for 20 hours to accomplish it, or 100 hours to accomplish it, or 1 hour to accomplish it, it doesn't matter. And that's a function of right sizing. So, if you're running your battery more often to achieve the same demand target reduction, then you might want to consider a smaller system that goes after an even spikier peak. But that's, you take the demand charge, you take the total monthly deduction, and you multiply them together to get the savings, regardless of how long the system runs. So that should get you through the quiz. We're out of time today. Looking forward to talking to you tomorrow. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Halfmoon.
All right, thanks very much, JR, and thanks everyone for attending this first section. Remember, your quiz will be sent to your email here shortly, and then once you've completed the quiz, you will have access to your certificate. If you don't pass the quiz right away, you'll be able to retake it until you receive a passing grade. This will conclude everything for today. Remember, we'll start the second part of the series tomorrow, again at 11 o'clock Central Time. Just like today. If you need any assistance with anything, please use one of the emails I sent to you to contact me. I'll be happy to help you. Again, thanks everyone, and see most of you tomorrow.